Welcome to Reinventing-U. I'm your host, Danielle Silverman. I believe that in today's world of ever-constant evolution, the only career change that matters is when what you do matches who you are and what you believe. This show is where you'll learn how embracing change and reinventing yourself will help you navigate any disruptions and lead a life of happiness and fulfillment, especially in this ever-changing world. Your purpose and your meaning will drive your personal transformation. As I like to say, it's your vision, your life. Be passionate about it. Reinventing-U starts now. Welcome, everyone. I'm Danielle Silverman, and you're listening to Reinventing-U on Transformation Talk Radio, a show about what it means to pursue a career and a life that corresponds to who you are, to help you find your purpose and to live it. If you'd like to learn more about what that means and what I do, I invite you to visit my website at www.reinventing-u, that's the letter U.com, and book a free session with me. In the last episode, I talked about the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. But do we really know why people are quitting their jobs? That's what we're going to look at in today's episode of Reinventing-U. We'll focus on why this is happening and what you can do if you find yourself wanting to quit your job, literally or quietly. But first, let's just take a quick review of what we talked about last week. What is the Great Resignation? Well, basically, it's people just getting up and quitting their jobs, mostly because they're not happy, they've decided that there is something else that they need to do with their life, but it's happening in very, very large numbers, much larger numbers than we've ever seen. Quiet quitting, on the other hand, is when you stay in your job, but you really just want to do the absolute minimum. You just do what the job description says. You're not looking to do anything else. You're basically, well, because employers are asking you to possibly work overtime or do more than what your job entails, and it's gotten very tiring. You're almost at burnout. And so instead, you just quietly quit your job. You're still there, but you're only doing the bare minimum. And we also looked at some statistics and some takeaways from a variety of surveys that were done in the past year only, this year as well. There were 5 that I found very interesting from the Microsoft survey. And the first was that employees have a new worth it equation. And that means that going to work has to be worth it for you. There has to be something in it for you to want to stay and not to just go in and pick up your paycheck. The second takeaway was that managers are feeling caught in between leadership and employee expectations. So leadership, for example, is saying, we want you to come back to work in a physical space, and employees are saying, no, we want to work remotely. And the poor managers are sort of stuck in between. So leaders really need to make the office worth the commute. It has to be part of their gift to you to make it worth it for you to come back to work. Another one of the takeaways was that flexible work doesn't always mean that you're always on. In other words, just because you're flexible doesn't mean I can reach you at 10 o'clock at night or at 6 o'clock in the morning. You aren't always on. Flexible means you can work from home, you can work from the office, you can work different times during the day, but it doesn't mean that I can reach you 24 hours a day. And the last one that I found very interesting was that rebuilding social capital looks different in a hybrid world. And that means that our connections are different. Because we're not physically with other people, the social aspect of our interactions is different. Now, I'm going to talk to at some point about networking, and I know that for some people that's a dirty word, but social networking, this social capital becomes very, very important. And so we're going to have to figure out, how do we do that without being necessarily in the same physical space? So what's really going on that employees want to quit their jobs? Well, one possibility might be that you don't feel valued. That means that whatever you do, whatever your manager tells you to do, and maybe you're very proud of the particular project that you're working on, but nobody's really paying attention. Nobody's saying, hey, attaboy or attagirl, you did a really good job, and I really appreciate what you're doing. Uh, Keep on going, or maybe we can tweak this, but there isn't that feedback that you get on a regular basis. What's another reason? Staff shortages. And staff shortages are real today, and it means that you're doing more with less. So you're overworked and you're feeling overwhelmed. Could be a good reason why you might want to just quit. And consequently, being overworked, feeling overwhelmed, you're getting frustrated and you're possibly close to burnout. What if you're in a role that you don't enjoy? Sometimes you go into a job and you're doing something that you thought would be really, really interesting, but it ends up that you aren't really enjoying it at all. Or maybe you don't have enough input into decision making. You have some really, really great ideas, but nobody's paying attention to them. They don't really see the value in what you're saying. And that's frustrating. Or on the other hand, maybe you don't have a clear career path. So you went into the organization thinking that, okay, this was possibly something that you would learn and then there would be somewhere to go after that. But there's no clear direction and nobody's really helping you figure out what's the next step. There isn't a clear career path. Now you'll notice that none of the issues that I've just brought up are things that you thought or knew might happen when you first started your job. They're not written anywhere in a contract, but somehow you have an expectation that certain things would come your way. So job satisfaction, for example, or the ability to evolve and grow in your career within the organization. But your employer also has certain expectations, some of which are clearly indicated in your job description, and others that are just not named anywhere, such as the expectation that you might work overtime if there's an important deadline to meet. We talk about these as unwritten rules. In 1960, that was a long time ago, Chris Argyris, who was a theorist and a professor emeritus at Harvard University, he coined the term psychological contract to talk about this. The term psychological contract refers to those often unspoken expectations and assumptions that two parties have of each other. So the employees and the organization, its leaders and managers, these are the two parties, and they have expectations and assumptions of each other about things like how they're going to behave and how they're going to act. So, for example, an organization might allow employees to use their work computers for personal issues during their breaks, or perhaps people are allowed to make or receive personal phone calls at work. And while these aren't part of your working conditions or part of your formal contract, and in fact, they might even be against the official rules, there's a type of informal, unspoken practice that develops over time. And eventually, this behavior becomes an expectation, and a psychological contract is created. I think a more common psychological contract is how people are treated within the organization. For example, as simple as expecting that exchanges remain polite, or that emails are not written all in capital letters. It says, I'm shouting at you. Or perhaps there's a norm about how you dress to come to work. In an artistic environment, well, that might be a really casual dress. But if you're working in a lawyer's office or in a financial institution, that dress might be more formal. Today, though, at least in North America, we don't always see men wear ties, even when the dress code is formal. Some things have changed, some things haven't. I always smile when I see hockey players coming into the arena before a game. They're always dressed really well. And the coaches sitting behind the bench always wear a suit and tie. I doubt that's written in the contract. And I find it really odd that sports can be so formal. But I guess they're in the public eye, much like the newscaster is on television. But I digress. If we stop and think about the conditions we sometimes assume come with the job, what sorts of things do you think of? The obvious things are wages paid for the job we perform. That's the written contract. And part of that written contract will also include vacation time, personal time off, or other benefits such as medical or dental. Overtime policy would be part of the written contract in a unionized environment, as would a number of other conditions. But what sorts of things are unwritten? What would you consider to be in the psychological contract? How about job satisfaction, as we stated earlier, or career advancement? How about work-life balance? How about security or safety? You know, just last week, I registered with a company that refers coaches. And they asked all the pertinent information and my phone number, my email address, all that stuff. And I did the onboarding on one afternoon. And the next morning, I received a phone call from someone saying they had picked up my name from that particular website and they were looking for a coach. And the more this person talked, the more I realized that, there was something wrong. And I basically said, I don't think I'm the right kind of coach for you. And at the same time, I'm trying to figure out, because it's the first interaction, right? I'm new to this. How did they get my number? Where is it written? This company didn't send me a referral saying, oh, you've got a match, you've got a client, you've got a potential client. And this person kept talking and going on and on and on and on. And before you know it, I was being sexually harassed over the phone. So I immediately got in touch with the company and said, hey, you want to keep your coaches safe? Please don't publish their phone number. Those kinds of things are not written in the contract necessarily. One way of looking at the issues that can be included in a psychological contract is the metaphor of the iceberg. So an iceberg is said to be 90% hidden under the water. And it's a concept that fits really well because most of the elements, most of the perceptions we talk about in psychological contracts are unwritten. So they're hidden, and very often they're not even talked about. The very top of the iceberg, the 10% that can be seen by the human eye, is work for pay. Very often work for pay and benefits. But the 90% of the iceberg that we can't see is the psychological contract, the unwritten rules or the assumed beliefs on either the part of the employees or on the part of management. If you imagine a more autocratic organization where mutual expectations are rarely, if ever, talked about, there's little clarity about what's expected of you as an employee. And in that case, we can imagine that the iceberg might be submerged as much as 95% or more. In a more modern organization, and you've got a more enlightened leadership, perhaps, the vision of the organization is clearly stated. It's often written on the walls of the organization, as is the mission. Hopefully there would be inputs from employees and mutually agreed upon goals. And in a case like that, you would probably see that the iceberg is submerged maybe 60 or 70%. And ideally, as leadership and employees discuss openly and as agreements are reached, then the ultimate wish would be that the iceberg would rise even more. Those are the ideal conditions. But what I'd like to talk about today is what happens when these informal psychological contracts are breached. So stay tuned. We'll talk about that when we come back from the break. Hi there, we're back on Reinventing-U with Danielle Silverman. This is the place where you can learn about career trends and be inspired about what to do with your life. If you'd like to learn more about this or book a free consult to speak with me about your particular needs, please visit my website at www.reinventing-u.com. So, just before the break, we were talking about psychological contracts. And I asked the question, what happens when these informal psychological contracts are breached? So, for example, when a new manager comes in and sets up a new work policy that goes against everything you've known up until then. And that, by the way, isn't a new phenomenon. That's something that's happened for years and years and years. Every time a new manager comes in, or new leader comes in, something changes. Or what happens when you work remotely and your employer has implemented a software that's able to detect the amount of time you spend working? You know that in today's remote and hybrid workplace, these things are real. What happens when your department or team is so short-staffed that you're expected to pick up the slack and work not only longer hours, but also doing things that were never part of your job? Imagine being in accounts payable and being asked to fill in some HR duties. Accounts payable, human resources. But you know, these things really are happening in the workplace today. And these kinds of breaches are broken promises because you've got an expectation that you're going to do a certain kind of job. They've hired you, they're paying you to do a certain kind of job. And all of a sudden you're doing something completely different. So this can be a significant cause of disruption and even conflict in the workplace. There's a study that was conducted in 2018 and found that that's not included those incidents that were never reported, workplace bullying by managers tends to increase during times of organizational change. And we know that organizational change is happening all around us. So you can imagine employees might have to work different hours, different ways with different managers, cross-functional matrix organizations. Managers' expectations change, and employees' expectations also change. And as a result, as an employee, you feel let down. You feel not valued or cared about. There's a breach in the psychological contract, a broken promise. And you know what? Psychological contract breaches have also been found to predict the intention of turnover. In other words, if you intend to quit your job, that can be predicted by the fact that the psychological contract has been broken. It also predicts increased sickness, stress, and conflict. You know, to me, this sounds a lot like what it might be behind not just the Great Resignation, but also quiet quitting. It's not because you're lazy. It's not because you don't want to work. It's because things have changed and you haven't been honored in a way that that works for you, that works for anybody. You know, when I was doing some research for this, I thought about what in my life have I felt like this, and there have been quite a few times. But I wanted to talk to you about a job that I had as director of marketing and communications for a software company. When I first started in this job, I had a small team, about 6 people, and I noticed that they were working overtime every single day. They would come in at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and they would leave at 7 o'clock at night. And while it wasn't technically or explicitly expected of them, like nobody told them they had to work overtime, so it wasn't a breach in a psychological contract in a way, but they didn't think twice about doing it, probably because they had a strong work ethic that weighed on them. And it made me think that maybe they had created their own psychological contract. But I bet you, if this had gone on for an extended period of time, we would have witnessed burnouts and quite possibly high turnover in the department. But as it turns out, or as it turned out, the reason they were working such long hours was not because we were understaffed, not because they were being asked to do more with less. It was because there were no procedures in place on how to do the very basic tasks. So once we figured that out and put the procedures in place, everyone was able to do their work within normal hours. And we were even able to increase our work output. But it took, what did it take? It took communication. It took awareness. It took somebody in the leadership position to say, what's going on here? This isn't normal. Today's world, though, is so very different. There are staff shortages. People are being asked to do more with less. You know, in Quebec province, where I live in Canada, nurses are expected, indeed, they're told that they have to work overtime, putting in 12 and sometimes 16-hour days. They actually call it compulsory overtime. That's the extent of the staff shortage in our healthcare system. Doctors are retiring. There aren't enough young doctors to replace them. And as a consequence, there are about 1.5 million people who are without a doctor. I mean, a GP, a family doctor, including a whole lot of seniors. The system is broken. And it's not just in healthcare. So what can we do? Well, whether you're an individual or an organization, it's time to look at reinventing, what the show is all about. So I was talking earlier about the iceberg as a metaphor for psychological contracts. And I made the bridge with reinvention because we also use the iceberg as a metaphor. Now I'll go into that in a little bit and tell you some stories about that. Reinvention is a practice, and it's also a profession. Its primary objective is to help organizations stay alive and thrive amidst the consistent, ongoing global change. And not just change, chaos, volatility, unpredictability, pandemics, hurricanes, war. The term VUCA was coined to describe this sort of state. VUCA is short for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Today, we speak about a BANI world, B-A-N-I, one that finds us brittle and anxious, and where things are nonlinear and incomprehensible. Anxiety in particular is one of the most present symptoms today, and it reflects the stress of our times, underscored by insecurities, fears, the risk of contracting COVID-19. Anxiety can lead to a state of passivity, because we fear making the wrong choices, or we fear making things worse. We delay decisions and actions, which in turn can lead to depression. In other words, quiet quitting. What can be done? Well, if something is brittle, you need to show capacity and resilience. You need to strengthen your teams. You need to invest in tools that can help make your organization more resilient. Implement a culture of collaboration to help increase communication and transparency between individuals, teams, departments, branches, countries. These are things that help you build the capacity to do more with less and help you become more resilient. If we feel anxious, well, we need empathy. We need mindfulness. And the best way to cope with anxiety is to raise awareness. You can't manage something if you can't control it. And you can't control what you're not aware of. So training employees in soft skills, for example, becomes increasingly important, as does offering courses in mindfulness or access to therapists and coaches as part of the company's social benefits. And you know, there are a lot of organizations out there today that are doing this. I'm so glad to see that. If something is nonlinear, well, it requires adaptability. You need to constantly look at things with fresh eyes and with an open, candid approach. Because if you're in a nonlinear world, rigid plans are a burden. No, they're a liability. If you don't reinvent, but you rely only on quote unquote proven methods of doing things, you'll find yourself behind the competition and you won't be able to adapt quickly enough to change, not in today's environment. So instead of looking at goals, for example, as a fixed point or number, look for a range. So if your sales target was, say, I don't know, $5 million for the quarter, well, maybe you make it 4.5 to 6 so that you're never caught short. And instead of making long-term plans, which in today's world I think is unheard of, create reviews, regular reviews within your plans to make sure you're still on track. Stop. Whatever the period is, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 quarter, whatever it is. I think a quarter is still a bit too long. Depends on the industry you're in. Create short reviews within your longer term plans to make sure you're still on track. And by the way, this is just as true for us as individuals as it is for organizations. Setting a range, for example, if you're trying to lose weight, instead of saying, I want to lose 20 pounds, studies have shown that people who set a range, who say, okay, I want to lose between 18 and 25 pounds, those people have more success than those who say, I want to lose 20 pounds. And they're not only do they have more success, but they're more likely to continue. So it works just as well for us as individuals as it does for organizations. And finally, when something is incomprehensible, it requires transparency and intuition. Transparency, like communication, reassures us because we can't always wait to fully explore what's happening before making a decision. We have to develop intuition. Yeah, I know that's also something that is quite daunting, but we need to learn to develop it and to rely on it. When we come back, I'm going to continue talking about reinvention, and we'll figure out why it's particularly important to us today. Stay tuned. You're listening to Danielle Silverman at reinventing-u.com on Transformation Talk Radio. Welcome back to Reinventing-U. Today, we're talking about psychological contracts and what organizations and individuals can do to create a better work environment, one that will ensure longevity and success for all. When organizations and individuals don't pay attention to these things, they suffer from what we call Titanic syndrome. You see, in reinvention, we also use the iceberg as a metaphor, because the story of the Titanic continues to be pertinent today. Everyone hears the story of the Titanic. We hear it when we're kids, that famous ship that was never supposed to sink. And I'm sure you remember the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, and the beautiful song by Celine Dion. The Titanic had the best and newest technologies of the time. And yet on April 15th, 1912, that's 100 years ago, just a little over 100 years ago, just to tell you, and it's still relevant today. About 340 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, it sank, taking with it over 1,000 passengers and crew. We grew up thinking and believing that the iceberg is what caused the Titanic to sink, when in fact, the iceberg was just what tipped it over. The real culprit was human error. Several human errors, in fact. So let me take you back through the history books with a few stories. The night of the collision. Imagine the air was clear and still. There were two people, lookouts, perched high above the mast in something that was called the crow's nest. They had with them a very large bell that they could grab so that they could get attention if they needed to. And they had a telephone that they could use to reach the captain's bridge. What they didn't have was a pair of binoculars. Now, imagine 100 years later, with all of the advances in modern technology, it's still hard to imagine any ship in open waters with no binoculars. Well, actually, the Titanic did have several binoculars on board, but they were locked up in a storage cabinet. The key to that cabinet was held by the second officer, a gentleman by the name of Blair, who, in a last-minute leadership change decision, was asked to leave the ship. He was asked to sit out the trip. He was very disappointed, of course, and he left the Titanic before it sailed from Southampton in England, forgetting to hand over his key to the person who was replacing him. Yes. I suppose the cabinet or its lock could have been broken, but nobody made that call. Nobody thought that they would need binoculars. The Titanic was invincible. One of the lookouts survived the disaster, and he later insisted that if binoculars had been available, the iceberg would have been spotted in enough time for the ship to take evasive action. But by the time the iceberg was noticed, the ship was too close to avert the disaster. This was quite literally a case of blinding overconfidence. Now, there's another story about the First Officer Murdoch. He had 16 years of maritime experience behind him. He was known to have a cool head, quick thinking, professional judgment. In fact, he was really particularly famous for his track record of averting ship collisions. On a previous assignment, he'd been second officer of a ship called the Arabic, or the Arabic, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And his commander had said, I want you to do this maneuver. And Murdoch knew instinctively that it was the wrong thing to do. So he countermanded, he overrode his superior's command, and he made a maneuver that had the two ships passing very close to each other, within inches of each other, but on a parallel track. They never collided, and there was no damage. So this was one of the many incidents in Murdoch's career, and he actually relied on his past successes to make another decision in the present, only this time it didn't work. It didn't work because he only had a certain span of time before the Titanic would invariably hit the iceberg. And there just wasn't enough time to do any maneuver that would help. So this is about focusing on past successes to make decisions in the present. An excellent lesson to be learned from there. Did you know that the Titanic's final voyage was also its very first? In fact, the ship had barely made it out of the construction site, and it had maybe a few hours of test runs in open waters before sailing across the ocean. The ship and the crew just simply didn't have enough time to gel together. And the most vital performance and safety procedures were never practiced. They did have mandatory sea trials that began at 6 a.m. on Tuesday, the 2nd of April, 1912, only 2 days after all the final fittings were completed, and barely 8 days before it was due to leave Southampton on its maiden voyage. Over the course of about 12 hours, the Titanic was navigated at different speeds, first in a protected area and then in open waters. The ship's turning ability was tested. They practiced a crash stop, and they learned that the Titanic was able to come to a full stop in 850 yards or 195 seconds. 12 days later, it would take the Titanic about 37 seconds from the moment the iceberg was first sighted to the moment the ship collided with it. But even more disturbing is that absolutely no safety drills were ever organized before or during the voyage. And no one among the leadership was in charge of passenger safety. And in an ironic twist of fate, there was a very first lifeboat drill scheduled for passengers and crew. It was scheduled for 11 a.m. on the day of the ship's sinking. But they never went through with it. And as a result, the crew had no idea how to act in a disaster. They hadn't developed any procedures. There were no skills built in for operating lifeboat equipment. There was no clear communication with passengers. There was no organization protocol. Nothing was designed or taught to the crew. The cost of no practice? Even though the ship carried 2,224 people. It only had lifeboats for 1,200. And with no practice for lifeboat operations, the crew deployed many boats half empty. And as a result, no more than 710 people survived. The importance of practice cannot be underestimated. I'm going to tell you one final story about the Titanic, and it's my favorite story. There was a little room on the ship. It was a radio room, and Marconi, the radio operator of the time, was testing a new system of communication based on Morse code. The radio operators were tasked with sending messages for first-class passengers. That was their job description. That was their sole focus and purpose, sending messages for first-class passengers. They did receive messages because there were ships in the ocean all around them. They received at least 6 messages, but they ignored those messages. They ignored them because for a message to be deemed urgent, it had to have a prefix on it. It had to have a title. They call it MSG, which stood for Master's Service Gram. And any message that had that heading, Master's Service Gram, would have made it compulsory for the radio operators to alert the captain. But for some reason, the messages didn't have that all-important heading. So the radio operators considered the messages to be not urgent. And even just a moment before the Titanic hit the iceberg, the senior radio operator is said to have wired the radio operator of a passing ship that was sending another warning with the following message. And he said, shut up, I am busy, I am working. Can you imagine? What would have happened if the radio operators on board the Titanic had listened to the warnings, Master's Service Gram or not, and considered that what they were doing was maybe not where they should be placing their attention? Sometimes looking at something the wrong way can lead to disaster. I'm telling you these stories in order to make a connection with what's going on today. It's important for everyone, organizations and individuals alike, to take notice of what's going on in the workplace today, to stop and think about the consequences of having employees quit their jobs in droves, or having them simply quietly go about their day and not put in the effort to help the organization move forward and thrive. The consequences of breaching the psychological contract in today's work environment is as serious as the Titanic hitting the iceberg. If you're a leader in an organization, take the time to listen to your people. Give them an opportunity to express what they're going through and actively work on coming up with solutions together. Emphasis on the word together. Maybe that means completely reviewing how you do your business. I know that sounds huge. But the alternative may mean that you simply won't be in business much longer unless you take drastic steps. I love the example of video rental giant Blockbuster. One day, the owner of a little startup called Netflix went to visit the president of Blockbuster to offer him an opportunity to invest in his company so that Blockbuster could offer their new service, this new service that Netflix has devised, to the Blockbuster customers. But the board of directors of Blockbuster was completely against the idea because a large percentage of their revenue was coming from late fees, from people not returning their videos on time. And this new service that Netflix was proposing would decimate that revenue. And they were too afraid to change. Do you know that at its height, Blockbuster employed 60,000 people and had 9,000 stores across North America? And of course, the rest is history. Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. Think about it. Are you at the head of an organization that might end up like Blockbuster? Or countless others that are also in the graveyard of Titanics? Kodak, who had already, before anybody else, developed digital photography, but they didn't believe it would take off. At one point, they were selling 90% of all photographic film and 85% of all cameras in the United States. And yet they were forced to file for bankruptcy in 2012. Nokia had been the #1 cell phone seller from 1998 to 2007, controlling at its prime 40% of the entire global handset market. And it was forced to sell its mobile devices business to Microsoft in 2013, just to save itself from its own collapse. And of course, we know of countless retail chains whose sheer number of physical locations just couldn't compete against online offers. The story of the Titanic is the most powerful example of a too big to fail mindset. Kodak and Nokia suffered from the same disease. The sheer size of the companies created an illusion of being untouchable and unsinkable. Enron, Lehman Brothers, Blockbuster, Toys R Us, Borders, all went through the same process of blind belief in their own ability to withstand any storm or disruption. How often are we blind to change? Simply because we're afraid of it. Remember the old sayings? Oh, we've always done it this way, or if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Those sayings simply don't work in today's world anymore. But it doesn't have to be that way. Being flexible enough to listen and anticipate what might be coming is a reinvention skill that you can learn to master. What would happen if we design change into how we operate in the world? Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean there isn't a better way. Think about what helps you practice, what can be improved. We can also learn how to implement strategies that are emergent and flexible enough to help us survive and thrive for both today and tomorrow. Because I can almost guarantee you that putting up with mass resignations and allowing employees to quietly quit will put your company out of business. As an organization, you owe it to your shareholders, your clients, your suppliers, and your employees to figure this out before going down in flames or in freezing waters. There's a great exercise called Kill the Company. I recommend it to any organization, association, community, nonprofit group. Just do it. In a nutshell, what you do is gather together a diverse group of employees, put them into small groups, and run a competition asking the question, what would you do to put us out of business today? That way you generate a wave of ideas or a wave of reinventions, and you could look at each idea and review what needs to change so that the company can continue to survive and thrive. Now, How does all this apply to you as an individual? In my view, there's several ways of looking at this. You can find ways to make the leaders of your organization listen. I have a colleague who lost her job within the company she was working for. Then she got hired back as a consultant. She started hosting what she called reinvention breakfasts, where employees would come and talk about what they were doing and how they might be able to make things better. Since then, the company implemented some of those things, and it has helped them. And my colleague was rehired to a full-time position in the company to work specifically as a chief reinvention officer. Find ways to have your leaders listen. Don't give up doing that. Don't give up on yourself. Which brings me to my final point about what you can do as an individual. Can you possibly create your very own psychological contract with yourself? There's a book that's been around for quite a while now called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. In his book, Don Miguel Ruiz talks about how we're taught to live by a set of rules that we haven't chosen for ourselves. He refers to it as our having been domesticated into believing certain things. We're taught at an early age by our peers, our parents, teachers, religion. We're told not to speak unless spoken to raise our hand in class. We're told to study this or to do that because that's what's supposed to bring us success. And success is supposed to lead to happiness. And we bring these beliefs with us into adulthood, not realizing that they no longer serve us. But they're so ingrained in us that they become part of our identity, except that they were never ours to begin with. They were imposed on us by other people. So no wonder we're searching for something, for some meaning in our lives. According to Don Miguel Ruiz, everything we do is based on agreements we've made. Agreements with ourselves, with other people, with God, with life. But the most important agreements are the ones we make with ourselves. In these agreements, we tell ourselves who we are, how to behave, what is possible, what is impossible. The agreements Don Miguel Ruiz first identified are: 1, be impeccable with your word. Speak with integrity. Say only what you mean. Avoid using the word to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. Number 2, don't take anything personally. Remember that feedback is about the person giving the feedback. What others do or say is not about you. It's a projection of their own reality. If you avoid taking things personally, you will save yourself immense suffering. Number 3 was don't make assumptions. Communicate as clearly as you can to avoid any misunderstandings, sadness, or drama. Find the courage to ask questions, to express what you really want. You'll find that this can completely transform your life. And number 4, always do your best. Yeah, your best is bound to change from time to time, depending on your life circumstances and whether you're healthy or not. Whatever the case, simply do your best and avoid self-judgment, self-abuse, and regret. A wise person once said to me, guilt is a useless emotion. I think of that when I think about doing my best. Unfortunately, we also all have many agreements that come from fear. These are the kinds of agreements that deplete our energy and diminish our self-worth. Well, it's time to let go of those agreements that come from fear and make way for new ones that will breathe life into what you do, that will be aligned with your own vision of the world. What I'm trying to say here is that I urge you to think about the psychological contract you have with yourself. What agreements are you going to write and live by? How do you define yourself? What are you going to do to bring yourself closer and closer to that definition of who you want to be? In Reinventing-U, we talk about these things in a down-to-earth, practical ways. No theory, no mumbo jumbo, only things that are of importance to you. It's about making sure that what you do matches who you are. If you'd like to chat about what that means for you, please visit my website to book a free call. It's www.reinventing-u, that's .com. That's www.reinventing-u.com. Thanks for listening to Reinventing-U with me, your host, Danielle Silverman. Until next time, I'm sending love your way. Thank you for listening to Reinventing-U with me, your host, Danielle Silverman. Tune in on the second and fourth Monday each month at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific on transformationtalkradio.com. Join me and feel inspired and optimistic about your future. We only get one life, so embrace change and thrive with me. Find work that aligns best with your soul and what you enjoy. For more information, go to reinventingu.com.